Just sign here, babe, taxes are boring, my husband Derek said every April for 7 years, sliding papers across the kitchen table while I nursed our morning coffee, trusting him completely because that's what wives did with husbands who handled the finances. I signed without reading, believing his reassurances that everything was fine, that our modest lifestyle reflected our modest income, that his late nights were legitimate work keeping us afloat. But why did I receive an IRS notice demanding $340,000 in back taxes and penalties while Derek was conveniently away on a business trip? And why did the forensic accountant I hired go pale when she uncovered what my husband had actually been doing for the past 7 years? Mrs. Patterson, your husband has been operating a consulting business that generated $2.3 million in unreported income. He listed you as co-owner. The IRS holds you jointly liable for every penny. I don't own any business. According to these tax returns, which bear your signature, you do. You've been filing jointly, claiming deductions for a company called Meridian Consulting LLC. She spread documents across her desk. A company registered in your name, operating from a P.O. box you've apparently never visited, generating income you've never seen. That's impossible. I'm a preschool teacher. I make $42,000 a year. And your husband, apparently, made considerably more. The question is why he hid it from you, and why he structured everything to ensure you'd be the one holding the liability when the IRS came calling. The marriage had seemed normal from the inside. 12 years with Derek. 2 children. A house in the suburbs that we'd stretched to afford. A life built on what I'd believed was partnership and shared sacrifice. Derek worked in consulting, he'd always been vague about the details, and I'd never pushed. He left early, came home late, traveled occasionally for client meetings. The income he deposited into our joint account was steady but modest, enough to cover our bills with little left over. Money's tight, he'd say when I suggested vacations or home improvements. Maybe next year. I'd believed him. I'd budgeted carefully, clipped coupons, worked extra shifts when needed. I'd been the responsible partner managing our limited resources while he supposedly worked himself ragged providing them. The reality was different. The reality was hidden income, secret accounts, and a deliberate scheme to use my identity as a shield against consequences he'd always planned to avoid. The IRS notice arrived on a Tuesday. Notice of deficiency, $340,000 in unpaid taxes, interest, and penalties. I called Derek immediately. His phone went to voicemail. I called his office, a number I'd rarely used, and discovered it had been disconnected. I called our bank. The joint account had been emptied the day before. I called his sister, his parents, his college roommate. No one had heard from him. No one knew where he was. By Wednesday, I understood, Derek was gone. He'd taken the money and disappeared, leaving me with a tax bill larger than our house's value and no explanation for how I accumulated it. The note arrived Thursday. Brief, impersonal, delivered to our mailbox like any other correspondence. I'm sorry it had to be this way. The marriage was already over. I've filed for divorce, the papers will arrive next week. Don't try to find me. I've protected myself legally. You should do the same. He'd protected himself. He'd left me with $340,000 in liability and advice to protect myself. The investigation began immediately. I hired Sandra Okonkwo, a forensic accountant recommended by a colleague whose ex-husband had pulled similar financial manipulation. Sandra was expensive, $300 per hour, but she offered payment plans for women in my situation. This pattern is more common than you'd think, she told me during our first meeting. Husbands who hide income, structure liability to fall on their wives, then disappear when the bills come due. It's a particular kind of financial abuse that the legal system is only beginning to recognize. I signed those tax returns. Doesn't that make me responsible? It makes you legally liable. It doesn't make you morally responsible, not if you were deceived about what you were signing. She opened her laptop. Let's find out exactly what your husband was doing. Meridian Consulting LLC was the centerpiece of the fraud. Derek had registered the company 8 years ago, 1 year before we started filing jointly. He'd listed me as sole proprietor, though I'd never signed any registration documents. The forgery was competent but not perfect. The company provided strategic consulting services to small businesses. It had generated substantial revenue, $200,000 to $400,000 annually, paid into accounts I'd never known existed, managed through systems I'd never accessed. Derek had reported just enough income on our joint returns to seem legitimate, while hiding the majority and claiming deductions that reduced his apparent tax burden to almost nothing. The IRS had eventually noticed the discrepancies. Their investigation had taken 2 years, years during which Derek had presumably been planning his exit. He knew this was coming, Sandra concluded. The timing of his departure, the emptied accounts, the pre-filed divorce papers, this was orchestrated. He used those 2 years to prepare an escape route. Where did he go? That's what we need to find out. Derek had fled to Portugal. Sandra's investigation, combined with resources from a private investigator I couldn't really afford, traced his movements through flight records, financial transactions, and digital breadcrumbs he'd carelessly left behind. He'd established residency in Lisbon, transferred funds to Portuguese banks, and apparently believed he was beyond American jurisdiction. He was wrong about that. But the process of proving it would take 14 months. The IRS case proceeded independently of my hunt for Derek. I applied for innocent spouse relief, a provision that could absolve me of liability if I could prove I'd been deceived. The burden of proof was on me. I had to demonstrate that I hadn't known about the unreported income, hadn't benefited from it significantly, and had signed the returns under false pretenses. This is harder than it sounds, my tax attorney explained. The IRS default position is that spouses who sign joint returns are responsible for their contents. You'll need to prove not just that you didn't know, but that you couldn't reasonably have known. I trusted my husband. Trust isn't a legal defense. We need documentation. The documentation Sandra had gathered helped. The forged business registration. The accounts I'd never accessed. The income discrepancy between what Derek deposited into our joint account and what Meridian Consulting actually earned. The deliberate structuring of the company to place liability on me while keeping control with him. The IRS innocent spouse application took 8 months to process. During that time, I lived under the weight of $340,000 in potential liability, unable to sell the house, unable to access credit, unable to plan any future that didn't involve financial ruin. The relief determination arrived on a Thursday. Based on the evidence provided, we have determined that you qualify for innocent spouse relief under IRC Section 6015(b). You are absolved of liability for the tax deficiency arising from Meridian Consulting LLC's unreported income. I sat in my car and cried for 20 minutes. The $340,000 was no longer my responsibility. The fraud Derek had constructed to destroy me had been recognized as exactly that, his fraud, not my negligence. But absolution from the IRS wasn't the same as justice. Derek was still free, still living comfortably in Portugal on money he'd hidden from me and from the government. The criminal case was separate from the civil determination. I wanted more than absolution. I wanted accountability. The extradition process was Byzantine. Derek's crimes, tax evasion, fraud, identity theft, were extraditable offenses under the U.S.-Portugal Treaty. But extradition requires cooperation between governments, legal proceedings in both countries, and patience that tested every limit I had. The assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Patricia Holloway who prosecuted financial crimes for 15 years. We have enough evidence to charge your husband with multiple federal offenses. The question is whether Portugal will surrender him. Will they? Eventually. Portugal doesn't want to become a haven for American tax cheats. But their legal system has its own procedures, and Derek has hired local lawyers to fight extradition. He's spending the money he stole to avoid consequences for stealing it. That's usually how it works. The good news is that fighting extradition is expensive. If we can freeze his accounts, which we're working on, he'll run out of resources to fight with. The 14 months of extradition proceedings felt like 14 years. I continued working, continued raising our children, continued rebuilding a life that Derek had tried to destroy. I sold the house, once the IRS cleared my liability, and moved into an apartment. I explained to my kids, ages 8 and 10, that their father had done something wrong and was living in another country to avoid accountability. Will he come back? My daughter asked. Eventually. Not because he wants to, but because he has to. Will he go to jail? That's for a judge to decide. I tried to be honest without being vindictive. They were victims too, abandoned by a father who'd valued his escape more than his family. The Portuguese court approved extradition after 9 months of legal wrangling. Derek's lawyers had argued everything: improper jurisdiction, insufficient evidence, political motivation, humanitarian concerns. The Portuguese judges had rejected every argument. The evidence of financial fraud is compelling. The United States has demonstrated probable cause for the charges. The extradition request is granted. Derek was arrested at his Lisbon apartment on a morning in March. According to reports I received later, he'd been eating breakfast when the police arrived. He'd apparently believed, until the very end, that his money and his lawyers would protect him. The money had run out. The lawyers had lost. The U.S. Marshals transported him back to federal custody. I wasn't present for the arrival. That wouldn't have been appropriate. But Patricia Holloway called me afterward. He's in custody. Arraignment is scheduled for Thursday. Bond will likely be denied given his demonstrated flight risk. What happens next? Trial, probably. His lawyers might negotiate a plea, but the evidence is strong. Multiple counts of tax evasion, fraud, and identity theft. He's looking at significant prison time. How significant? If convicted on all counts, potentially 15 to 20 years. More realistically, if he pleads, 8 to 12. 8 to 12 years. For what he'd done to me, to our children, to our family. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The trial took 3 weeks. I testified on the second day. The prosecutor walked me through 7 years of tax seasons, 7 years of, just sign here, babe, 7 years of trusting a man who'd been systematically preparing to abandon me. Did you ever see the full tax returns before signing? No. Derek handled all financial documents. He said taxes were complicated and I shouldn't worry about them. Did you know about Meridian Consulting LLC? No. I had no idea the company existed until the IRS notice arrived. Did you know your husband was generating income beyond what he deposited into your joint account? No. I believed we were struggling financially. I worked extra shifts, budgeted carefully, denied myself things I wanted because I thought we couldn't afford them. And during this time, what was your husband actually doing? According to the evidence, he was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars, hiding it from me, and structuring his business to ensure I would be liable for his tax evasion. The jury listened carefully. Derek's attorneys tried to argue that I'd been complicit, that I must have known something, that my ignorance was willful rather than genuine. The evidence didn't support their arguments. Derek took the stand in his own defense. His lawyers had advised against it, that much was obvious from their expressions. But Derek had always believed he could talk his way out of anything. I made mistakes with the business structure, he admitted. But I never intended for my wife to face consequences. I always planned to resolve the tax issues before they became serious. You fled the country the day before your wife received the IRS notice, the prosecutor pointed out. That suggests you knew exactly what consequences were coming. I panicked. The marriage was ending. I needed time to think. You needed time to escape accountability for crimes you'd committed over 7 years. That's not fair. Mr. Patterson, you forged your wife's signature on business documents. You listed her as sole proprietor of a company she didn't know existed. You signed joint tax returns that underreported income by millions of dollars. You emptied your joint bank account and fled the country, leaving her with $340,000 in liability. The prosecutor paused. What part of that is unfair? Derek had no good answer. He never had. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all counts. Tax evasion, fraud, identity theft, making false statements to federal agents during the investigation. Derek's face went gray as the foreman read the verdict. He'd maintained confidence throughout the trial, that particular arrogance that had allowed him to deceive me for years. The confidence finally shattered when consequences became real. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. The federal guidelines suggested 10 to 14 years. The judge would decide within that range. I attended the sentencing hearing. I hadn't planned to speak, the prosecutor had made the case effectively, and victim impact statements felt performative for something this personal. But the judge invited me to address the court, and I found I had things to say. For 7 years, I believed I was in a partnership. I believed the man I married respected me enough to be honest about our shared life. I was wrong about all of it. Derek wouldn't look at me. His attorneys had probably advised him to show remorse, but he couldn't seem to manage it. He didn't just steal money. He stole my sense of security, my ability to trust, my children's faith in their father. He structured his crimes to ensure I would face consequences while he escaped. That's not just fraud, that's cruelty. I turned to address the judge directly. I'm not asking for vengeance. I'm asking for accountability. For 7 years, he acted as if consequences didn't apply to him. For 14 months, he fought extradition as if he could escape justice permanently. He needs to understand that actions have consequences, not just for the people he targeted, but for himself. The sentence was 12 years. Derek would serve at least 10 before parole eligibility. He'd be in his mid-50s when he emerged, his career destroyed, his reputation ruined, his family gone. The marshals led him away in handcuffs. The handcuffs fit perfectly, that phrase had echoed in my mind since I'd first imagined this moment, during those dark months when I'd faced $340,000 in liability and a husband who'd vanished. The handcuffs fit perfectly, and he'd earned every link. Rebuilding took years. The financial recovery was relatively quick, the innocent spouse relief cleared my liability, and the house sale provided enough for a fresh start. The emotional recovery took longer. My children struggled with their father's imprisonment. Explaining financial crimes to a 10-year-old requires simplification that doesn't quite capture the betrayal. They visited him occasionally. I didn't prevent that, despite everything, but the relationship was strained in ways that might never heal. My own recovery involved therapy, support groups for women who'd experienced financial abuse, and the gradual reconstruction of my ability to trust. Not all partners will deceive you, my therapist reminded me during one session. I know that intellectually. But not emotionally? Not yet. Maybe not ever. Learning to trust again wasn't about forgetting what Derek had done. It was about recognizing that his actions reflected his character, not some universal truth about relationships. Some people deceive. Some people don't. The challenge was learning to distinguish between them. I remarried 5 years after Derek's conviction. His name was Marcus. He was a firefighter, practical, honest, constitutionally incapable of the kind of elaborate deception Derek had maintained. He understood my need for financial transparency, my insistence on reviewing every document before signing, my occasional moments of irrational suspicion. "You have reasons," he said when I apologized for checking our accounts more frequently than necessary. "You're not being paranoid. You're being careful. That's different. Most people don't check their joint accounts twice a week. Most people haven't been through what you've been through. I'd rather you check twice a day and feel secure than check never and feel anxious." That was the difference, I realized. Marcus wanted my security. Derek had wanted my vulnerability. Derek was released after 10 years. I received notification through the Victim Services Coordinator. He'd served his time, completed required programs, and been paroled to a halfway house in a city far from where I lived. He'd tried to contact the children during his imprisonment, with limited success. Our son, now 20, refused all communication. Our daughter, 18, had exchanged occasional letters but maintained distance. "He wants to rebuild relationships," she told me once. "He says prison changed him." Maybe it did. People can change. Do you believe that? About him? I believe he served consequences for what he did. Whether that changed who he fundamentally is, that's something only time will reveal. I paused. "You're an adult now. Your relationship with your father is your decision. Just go in with clear eyes." "Like you didn't?" "Exactly like I didn't. Learn from my mistakes." The forensic accountant who'd unraveled Derek's scheme became a friend. Sandra had seen too many cases like mine, women blindsided by financial crimes they'd unknowingly participated in. She'd started a nonprofit providing free forensic accounting services to domestic abuse survivors facing financial manipulation. "Your case helped me understand how sophisticated this abuse can be," she told me once. "Derek wasn't just hiding money. He was constructing a liability shield using your identity. That takes planning, patience, and a complete absence of conscience. He had all three. So do many abusers. The financial system isn't designed to protect against intimate partner fraud. We trust families. We trust marriages. We don't anticipate that someone would spend 7 years systematically preparing to destroy their spouse. What changes that? Awareness. Education. Legal reforms that recognize financial manipulation as a form of abuse." She smiled slightly. "And forensic accountants who know where to look. The tax returns I sign now are reviewed thoroughly before I add my signature. Marcus understands. He prepares our finances together, explains every deduction, shows me every document. The transparency isn't about distrust, it's about partnership that includes shared knowledge. Sign here, babe, taxes are boring." I hear Derek's voice sometimes, echoing across years. The casual dismissal that had cost me so much. I sign my name on documents I've read, returns I've understood, finances I've verified. I sign as someone who learned that trust isn't given blindly, it's built through transparency, demonstrated through honesty, maintained through respect. Derek asked me to trust blindly. Marcus asks me to trust with open eyes. The difference is everything. He told me to just sign here for 7 years. I trusted him. I believed him. I signed tax returns I never read for a business I didn't know existed. When the IRS came for $340,000, he'd already fled the country, emptied our accounts, and left me holding liability he'd carefully constructed to fall on me. But I found him. A forensic accountant, a private investigator, an extradition treaty, and 14 months of relentless pursuit. They brought him back in handcuffs. 12 years in federal prison for the fraud he'd built on my trusting signature. The handcuffs fit perfectly. So does the lesson: never sign what you haven't read, never trust what you haven't verified, and never assume the person sharing your bed shares your best interests.